Hey everyone, Matt here, and welcome to the show today. Today we're going to talk about sexual orientation OCD, and we're going to kind of talk about kind of a wide range of topics with this, but it's obviously in our Intrusive Thoughts series. And so I wanted to dive into this topic as well. And just a quick reminder, we are going to be hosting an Intrusive Thoughts workshop coming up here at the end of the month. And if you're watching this or listening to this sometime way in the future, we'll have the replay available in the notes as well. So if you're seeing this before August 30th of 2023, be sure to check out the workshop, claim your seat. It is a paid workshop, but want to make sure that you get your seat because we have, I think, 100 seats available. So on the workshop, we're going to be talking about 10 different forms of intrusive thoughts and really going in depth to each of them, as well as talking about strategies, tools, and tactics, and really mindset shifts to really break out of the loops. So also, if you are a follower of the show, please help us out by liking and subscribing and leaving a nice comment or review on iTunes and Spotify, as it just really helps our show. So today, I want to dive into, the whole idea of sexual orientation OCD, and this takes on so many different names. It can be SO-OCD for sexual orientation. It can be called gay OCD. You can even call it straight OCD, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is when the mind starts coming up with this what if thinking regarding one's sexuality, or it could even be gender identity. What if I'm trans? What if I'm, a different gender, right? All of that, right? And so the mind really kind of latching onto this and this loop forming around that. So, when it comes to this idea, right, I think what is, so when you go to people who are wrestling with this, if they go to a traditional therapist, and the therapist attempts to kind of work at this from a sexuality standpoint, it generally leads to more confusion and chaos. And this is why when we're talking about this, what the person's experiencing are these ego dystonic thoughts about, intrusive sexual thoughts, right? And so the person usually is very clear on who they know themselves to be, but their mind is saying all this what if thoughts about, generally content that they don't want, much like we talked about in the harm thoughts in the last one, right? These thoughts are ego dystonic. They're not something they want to think about. They don't derive any pleasure from these thoughts. They're very disturbing, very intrusive, very against who they are, right? And that's why, just in the same way with intrusive thoughts about harm, we don't work at it from this angle that this person's really some serial killer psychopath, right? We're like, oh, these are intrusive, harmful thoughts, right? And it's obviously usually very clear to the therapist when someone's really talking about their sexuality versus having intrusive thoughts that are sexual in nature, and that's where, this can take on, incestual forms as well, like with parents and children and, all sorts of stuff, right? And I think that's why it's like, I don't even really like having this like sexual orientation necessarily label on it, or even the more narrow the label gets, the more confusing I think it gets for people, because it's starting to validate that certain intrusive thoughts are more valid that we should pay attention to and figure out. And that's part of the issue as a whole, right? Once you realize that within the realms of OCD and anxiety, and kind of psychological stress as a whole, intrusive thoughts tend to break up into three main categories, and it tends to be harmful, sexual, and religious, or even existential. And this is the themes that people tend to get caught in. And so getting a narrow like HOCD or SO-OCD, it doesn't serve the person, in my opinion, because we're talking about a very broad thing here. We're talking about this loop. And this loop, you insert any thought you want into the top of that loop, because if you're engaging in behaviors, that loop's going to keep going. And when we're talking about, worrying about one's sexuality, in every case, the person's usually very clear, like, hey, look, I've known forever, like, this is who I am, and now I'm having these intrusive thoughts. And this is why, it's so interesting, because like it can take on different forms, right? You can have someone who has identified as straight their whole life and is, all of a sudden I had this intrusive thought and it's like, well, what if I'm gay? Or you can have someone who's like, hey, I've been gay my whole life and now I'm like, what if I'm straight? And when that loop forms, it just tends to get more chaotic, more confusing, and the more and more they try to rationalize and think, the more lost they get in that OCD and anxiety wheel. And that's why what happens in almost any instance is when the loop breaks, the person's always very clear about who they are, right? It's when they get in the loop that the chaos tends to ensue. So when we're working at this, you want to work at it from the loop perspective, just like anything else. And we want to eliminate all the compulsions that the person's engaging in that's feeding and reinforcing this loop. And again, realizing that like the mind is coming up with all this what if and doubt, and that's what it does when this loop goes on. And these intrusive thoughts happen in their normal experience, because what I think happens with a lot of people, especially, in Western culture, there's obviously a very big conversation going on with a lot of stuff related to sexuality and gender identity. And what can happen is OCD can really latch onto that and kind of get into the mix. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that stuff like that, but they really are apples and oranges, right, at that time. And that's why trying to use the wrong model or wrong kind of intervention when it comes to OCD, regardless of the theme, is inappropriate, and it's not going to help the person. And so when it comes to this, it's really just about understanding this idea of this loop and understanding that when the loop breaks, what seems to happen is the nervous system tends to regulate and go from that the sympathetic to the parasympathetic. And when the person's in the parasympathetic and they're calm and they feel safe, there's always an immense clarity about who they are, who they're the persons that they're sexually attracted to, and there's not this grand confusion. But when the stress levels kick up in their body, and their sympathetic nervous system gets activated, that tends to be when the most confusion is there. So what we want to do is we really want to work at it from like a nervous system standpoint, and not trying to get reassurance and dive deeper into these topics as much as we want to calm the nervous system down, because when that happens, clarity tends to emerge for the person. So I just want to talk about that from that perspective. Really introduce it. And I know this is a wide range of topics here that we're covering on this episode, but we're going to dive in deeper into this in the workshop. So make sure to claim your seat if this is something that you're interested in, because I think we'll only have about 100 for the workshop, and it is happening on August 30th. So the link is right down in the notes. And then if you're watching this past that date or listening to this past that date, we'll have the replay available for you as well. So hope this was helpful. And with that said, I wish you guys a great day, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Hey there. So if you enjoyed that video, we've linked up a few more videos that we think you'd find helpful as well. And if you have found this helpful, we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing. And if you're looking for help and guidance, please check out restoredminds.com, as we have several options for you to get started. See you guys soon.